Strategic thinking for everyday decisions. Your life is not shaped by big decisions. It is shaped by unnoticed small ones. Think about that for a moment, not abstractly, concretely. Think about yesterday, the sequence of small choices from the moment you woke until the moment you stopped being conscious. What you reached for first, what you said to whom and how, what you put into your body, what you gave your attention to and for how long, what you deferred and what you acted on, what you consumed without thinking. Most of those choices were not made, they were executed. There was no deliberation, no evaluation of alternatives, no assessment of what each option would cost or produce. They happened in the mode of habit, of default, of least resistance, the automatic pilot that runs human behavior for the majority of waking hours, even in people who consider themselves deliberate and thoughtful. That automatic pilot is not neutral. It has been shaped by something, by environment, by repetition, by the accumulated pressures and rewards of your history. And every day it runs, it strengthens itself. The choices made automatically today make tomorrow's automatic choices more likely. The patterns running your behavior now are the ones that ran yesterday and will run tomorrow unless something explicitly interrupts them. Most people react daily. Few people design daily. The person who reacts lives inside whatever the day presents. Their mood, their decisions, their use of time and attention, all of it shaped primarily by what comes at them rather than by what they have established in advance. They are responsive, adaptable, present, and they are, over time, being written by circumstances rather than writing them. The person who designs is doing something structurally different. They are not less present, not less engaged with what the day actually brings, but they have established, before the day's pressures arrive, a set of structures, habits, defaults, frameworks, decision rules that govern how they will respond when the day's options present themselves. They are not reacting to each choice from scratch. They have predated. This is not about control in the rigid sense. It is not about planning every hour or eliminating spontaneity or reducing life to an optimized schedule. It is about something more fundamental, the relationship between your thinking and your behavior. Most people's thinking follows their behavior rather than guiding it. They act and then they explain. They decide and then they rationalize, the sense that their choices are the products of deliberation, that they thought about it and then did it is, much of the time, a story constructed after the fact. The actual decision preceded the reasoning. The reasoning was assembled to make the decision make sense. Strategic thinking, applied to daily life, changes this relationship. It places the thinking before the behavior, not in every moment, which would be both impossible and exhausting, but in the moments that matter, the design of defaults, the construction of decision rules, the deliberate shaping of the environments in which automatic choices happen. By the end of this audiobook, you will understand how your mind actually makes decisions, including the mechanisms it uses to convince you that you are being rational when you are not, the conditions under which the quality of your thinking degrades in predictable ways, and the specific design principles through which intelligent people build lives that run better than they can consciously manage. This is not motivation, this is architecture. The difference will become clear. Introduction: Why strategic thinking is rare. Strategic thinking is not rare because it is difficult to understand. The principles are not complex. Think before acting. Consider consequences before committing. Design systems rather than relying on willpower in the moment. These are not mysterious insights. Most people asked to describe what strategic thinking looks like could do so with reasonable accuracy. The rarity of strategic thinking in practice has a different explanation. It is rare because it runs against the grain of how minds naturally operate and because the conditions of modern life consistently push against it in specific, identifiable ways. The human mind is not built for strategic thinking as its default mode. It is built for speed, for the rapid generation of responses to immediate stimuli, for pattern matching against previous experience to produce quick assessments and quicker actions. This is not a flaw. It is a feature. The ability to respond fast to assess a situation and produce a behavioral response without laborious deliberation was extraordinarily valuable in environments where delay could be genuinely costly. The problem is that the modern environment is not the environment this cognitive architecture was designed for. The stimuli are different. The time horizons that matter are longer. The consequences of impulsive decisions often do not arrive immediately. They compound over months and years, quietly and invisibly, until they become problems that are difficult to attribute to any single decision. The mind's fast response system keeps running because it was built to run. And the very efficiency of that system, the way it produces confident, fluent responses without requiring conscious effort, makes it difficult to recognize how often it is producing answers that would not survive deliberate scrutiny. The gap between impulse and calculation is where strategic thinking lies, and that gap is systematically narrow for most people. An impulse is the mind's immediate output, the first syllable response to a situation, generated rapidly, carrying the authority of apparent certainty. It feels like a conclusion when it is often a draft. It presents itself as obvious when it is frequently one of several options that were never evaluated. Calculation in the specific sense used throughout this audiobook does not mean long, deliberate analysis of every decision. That would be paralyzing. It means the briefest possible moment of structural assessment. What is this decision actually choosing between? What are the first-order consequences, and what comes after them? What do I actually value here, as opposed to what I feel like doing right now? Is this a decision that benefits from being made now, or is time an asset I should use? These questions take seconds when they are habitual. They take considerably longer when they are foreign to the person being asked to ask them. The training this audiobook describes is partly the training of making those questions automatic, of building a cognitive habit of brief, structural assessment that runs as a thin layer between impulse and action without slowing life to a crawl. Myodations are the foundation of the future. This is perhaps the most important sentence in this introduction, and it deserves expansion. There is a compelling illusion that the shape of a life is determined primarily by its major inflection points: the career choice, the relationship committed to or ended, the city moved to, the significant investment made or declined, the crisis navigated well or poorly. These events seem, in retrospect, to be the ones that determined what came after. The retrospective feeling is genuine. The analysis it produces is incomplete. What the major inflection points actually represent is the accumulation of hundreds of smaller decisions that preceded them. The career that became available or unavailable was shaped by what was done with mornings over the previous 3 years. The relationship that reached a major crisis or a major deepening was shaped by thousands of small choices about attention, honesty, and engagement that preceded the moment of crisis. The financial decision that seemed momentous was shaped by what had been done with smaller sums before it, and what habits of thinking about money had been practiced. The major decision is the visible event. The myodations are the geological forces that produce the terrain on which the major decision took place. This reframing changes what deserves attention. If life is primarily shaped by its major moments, then the intelligent strategy is to make those major moments count, to bring your best thinking to the significant crossroads and handle them well. The rest of the time can run on automatic. If life is primarily shaped by its accumulated myodations, then the intelligent strategy is almost the inverse. The major moments will largely take care of themselves if the daily patterns are well designed. And the daily patterns: what you attend to, how you respond to friction, what you consume, what you defer, what you consistently do, or exactly what the rest of this audiobook addresses. A final point for this introduction about the nature of what is being built here. Strategic thinking applied to daily decisions is not a technique. It is not a set of frameworks to be memorized and applied. It is a habit of mind, a persistent quality of attention that, once developed, runs through every interaction, every choice, every assessment of what deserves your time and what does not. Habits of mind are built the same way all habits are built: through repetition, through the consistent practice of a particular kind of response until it becomes the default mode rather than the deliberate effort. This is why the early chapters of this audiobook focus on understanding the mechanisms of how your mind currently works before arriving at the practices through which it can be redesigned. Understanding the mechanism is not the same as changing it, but it is the necessary precondition. You cannot interrupt a pattern you cannot see, and most of the patterns this audiobook describes are invisible precisely because they are so thoroughly automated. See them clearly first, then begin to work with them. Chapter 1: First Order versus Second Order Thinking. When most people think about thinking, they picture a process that is linear and thorough. A situation presents itself. The mind evaluates the available options. The consequences of each option are assessed. A choice is made that reflects the genuine best interest of the person making it. The person moves forward, having engaged in the kind of deliberate reasoning that the situation required. This description is accurate for a narrow slice of human decision-making. For the vast majority of choices, including choices of significant consequence, it describes something that does not happen. First-order thinking is the default. It is the cognitive mode that considers only the immediate and obvious result of an action. If I do this, what happens next? This question is asked, answered quickly with reference to the most obvious and proximate consequence, and the answer is treated as sufficient basis for decision. The process is fast. It produces conclusions that feel complete. It involves a genuine assessment of consequences, but only the first layer of them. Consider a simple example. Someone is offered a piece of work that pays well, but is not aligned with the direction they want their career to move. First-order thinking asks, does this pay well? Yes. Does it provide something I need right now? Income, engagement, a professional relationship? Yes. Therefore, take it. The answer is internally consistent. The reasoning is valid at the level at which it operates. What it omits is every consequence that follows from the first one. The reputation built by the work you do. The contacts you make or fail to make in environments that are or are not aligned with your direction. The time and cognitive capacity occupied by this project that is therefore not available for something else. The signal sent to your own sense of what your time and skills are worth. The precedent established about the kinds of opportunities you accept. The compounding of all of these over months and years into a trajectory that may or may not look like where you intended to go. None of this appears in the first-order assessment, and the first-order assessment, having produced a confident answer, does not feel incomplete. That is perhaps the most important feature of first-order thinking. It does not feel like it is missing something. Second-order thinking extends the question. Not just if I do this, what happens next? But if I do this, what happens next, and then what happens after that? And what follows from that? And who else is affected, and how, and what does their response produce in turn? This extension is not about achieving certainty about distant futures. Uncertainty is real, and pretending to know exactly what a decision will produce 5 years from now is a different kind of intellectual error. Second-order thinking is about disciplined projection, not certainty, but structured consideration of probable and possible consequences beyond the immediate. It is asking, what world does this decision create? Not just for the next day or the next month, but for the next year, the next several years, the trajectory that this choice initiates. And it is asking that question honestly, not selectively, not in the way that confirmation bias assembles evidence for what you already want to do, but with genuine openness to the possibility that the immediate attractive consequence is followed by second-order consequences that you do not want. Why do most people think on one level? Several mechanisms are responsible, and they are worth understanding individually. The first is cognitive load. Second-order thinking requires working memory. It requires holding multiple scenarios in mind simultaneously, tracking the interrelations between them, evaluating probabilities, and maintaining the clarity of the original question while exploring its ramifications. This is demanding. The mind, which is built for efficiency, tends to find the first satisfactory answer and stop. Going further requires deliberate effort that, in the middle of a busy day, in the middle of the pressures of a normal life, is difficult to supply. The second mechanism is temporal discounting. Human psychology systematically undervalues future consequences relative to immediate ones. This is not a rational calculation. It is a perceptual bias. The distant consequence appears smaller, less vivid, less certain than the immediate one. An outcome that will arrive in 3 years feels genuinely less real than an outcome that arrives today, even when the 3-year outcome is objectively larger. This discounting is especially powerful when the immediate consequence is emotionally appealing. The thing you want now creates a kind of perceptual fog that makes the future consequences harder to see clearly. The desire to say yes today makes the costs of that yes in the future seem smaller than they are. The third mechanism is the illusion of reversibility. Most people, when making decisions, carry an implicit assumption that the decision can be revisited if the consequences turn out to be undesirable. I can always change course. If this doesn't work out, I can adjust. This safety net, real in some cases, illusory and many reduces the urgency of thinking through consequences carefully in advance. The problem is that many decisions are less reversible than they appear, not because they cannot technically be undone, but because the cost of undoing them in time, in relationships, in some effort, in opportunity cost is much higher than the cost of thinking through the second-order consequences before committing. The person who takes the poorly aligned work and then, 6 months later, finds themselves in a professional position they didn't intend, can technically reverse. But the reversal costs time, costs professional capital, costs the energy that was invested in something that needed to be undone. The reversibility was real but expensive. There is a specific quality of second-order thinking that separates it from simple pessimism or excessive caution, a quality that needs to be named clearly. Second-order thinking is not the practice of always imagining the worst. It is the practice of following the chain of consequences wherever it leads, including when it leads somewhere genuinely good, including when the second-order consequences are more attractive than the first-order ones. Consider the inverse of the earlier example. Someone is offered a piece of work that is poorly paid but is closely aligned with the direction they want to move. First-order thinking says this pays poorly, therefore it is a poor choice. Second-order thinking follows the chain: this pays poorly, but it builds the right skills, creates the right contacts, positions you in the right environment, contributes to a reputation in the space you want to occupy, and teaches you what you cannot learn from work that pays better but is less relevant. The second-order assessment may arrive at the opposite conclusion from the first-order one and may arrive there with better justification. Second-order thinking is more accurate, not inherently more cautious. It produces better decisions not because it encourages hesitation, but because it encourages completeness. How do you develop second-order thinking in practice? The core discipline is simple to describe and demanding to execute before committing to a decision. Require yourself to articulate at least one consequence beyond the first one. Not a comprehensive analysis, not a planning document. Just "and then what?" That phrase, "and then what?" is among the most valuable cognitive tools available. It extends the time horizon of your assessment by one layer. It creates the habit of not treating the immediate consequence as the final consequence. And it does so with minimal cognitive overhead. It is a small prompt that produces a specific and useful kind of thinking without requiring extraordinary effort. With practice, the habit extends itself. The second question leads to a third. The automatic depth of assessment increases incrementally. What began as a deliberate intervention, a forced pause to ask the next question, becomes part of the default thinking process. There is a secondary practice that accelerates this development, and it is the practice of retrospective second-order analysis. Look at decisions you made in the past, significant ones, or a sample of daily ones, and trace their consequences. Not to evaluate yourself or to assign blame for outcomes that were negative, but to observe what did the first-order assessment predict would happen? What actually happened? What were the second and third-order consequences that the original assessment did not consider? Were they positive or negative? Could they have been anticipated? This retrospective practice builds pattern recognition. It gives you a more accurate model of the kinds of second-order consequences that tend to follow from particular kinds of decisions. It calibrates your predictions by comparing them to actual outcomes. And it does something that purely forward-looking analysis cannot. It connects the abstract concept to the lived texture of your own experience. The decisions that taught you the most were probably the ones whose second-order consequences differed most from what you expected. That divergence between the anticipated and the actual is exactly the kind of information that builds second-order thinking. There is a broader claim embedded in this chapter that deserves to be stated explicitly. The quality of your decisions is determined, more than any other single factor, by the depth to which you think about them. Not the time spent. Extensive deliberation is not the same as deep thinking. Not the information gathered. More data without better frameworks produces only more confident wrong answers. But the depth of the conceptual frame applied to the decision, how many levels of consequence are considered, how honestly the assessment is conducted, how clearly the question being decided is actually identified. Second-order thinking is that framework. It is not complex. It is not expensive to practice. But it is, in the daily experience of most people, genuinely rare. And its rarity is an opportunity because the person who consistently applies it operates at a distinct advantage relative to those who do not, in every domain where decisions determine outcomes. Which is every domain. Chapter 2: Emotional Bias and Daily Choices. You believe you make decisions based on reasons. You are mostly wrong. This is not an insult. It is a description of how human cognition actually works, a description that applies equally to everyone, including people of exceptional intelligence, including people who pride themselves on their analytical capacity, including people who would resist this characterization most strongly. The research on this is extensive and consistent. Human beings are not primarily rational animals who experience emotions. We are emotional animals who experience rationality. The feeling comes first, faster and more powerfully than the reasoning. The reasoning, in most cases, is constructed afterward to justify the feeling. Emotional bias in daily choices does not operate through obvious channels. It does not typically look like a person in the grip of strong feeling making a visibly emotional decision. It operates more subtly than that, through the background texture of state that colors perception, through the mood that determines what information seems relevant, through the emotional valence of the choice being made and how that valence interacts with the emotional valence of the person making it. Your emotional state when you make a decision shapes what information you notice. A person in an anxious state attends more readily to information about potential threats and negative outcomes. A person in a confident, positive state attends more readily to information about opportunity and upside. The information in the environment has not changed. The state doing the attending has. And the decision that emerges reflects the information that was noticed, which is to say, it reflects the state as much as it reflects the situation. This mechanism has a name in psychology: effect heuristic. A heuristic is a cognitive shortcut, a quick rule of thumb the mind uses to make judgments without exhaustive analysis. The effect heuristic is the use of current emotional state as a proxy for the quality or desirability of a choice. If you feel good right now, options look better. Their risks seem smaller, their benefits seem larger, the obstacles seem more surmountable. If you feel bad right now, options look worse. Their risks seem more probable, their benefits seem less certain. The effort required seems less worthwhile. This is not reasoning, but it feels like reasoning. The assessment arrives with the texture of considered judgment. It seems like you evaluated the option and found it promising, or found it wanting. What actually happened is that your current emotional state evaluated the option and produced a rating, and then your mind constructed a rationale to match that rating. The construction is seamless. In the normal course of daily experience, you cannot observe the sequence, the feeling producing the assessment, the reasoning following to justify it. The experience from the inside is of considering something and reaching a conclusion. The actual process involved the conclusion preceding the consideration in most cases. Several specific patterns of emotional bias recur across different kinds of decisions and are worth knowing by name. The first is the availability heuristic. When you assess the probability or significance of something, you use how easily examples of it come to mind as a proxy for how common or important it is. Things that are recent, vivid, or emotionally resonant come to mind easily and are therefore judged as more common or more significant than they actually are. Things that are abstract, statistical, or emotionally neutral are harder to retrieve and therefore systematically underestimated. The practical consequence: you overweight whatever last happened to you, whatever you were recently exposed to, whatever carries emotional salience. You underweight the statistical base rate, what actually tends to happen in situations like this. On average, over time, and decisions based on what's most available rather than what's most accurate tend to be systematically skewed in predictable ways. The second pattern is status quo bias. The current state of affairs, however it came about, is treated as the reference point, and departures from it are evaluated in terms of what they cost relative to that reference. Moving away from the status quo requires justification. Staying requires none. The asymmetry is emotional in origin. The prospect of loss, of giving up what you currently have, produces more psychological discomfort than the prospect of equivalent gain produces pleasure. This loss aversion, as it's called, means that people routinely avoid changes that would benefit them, because the costs of changing feel larger than the benefits, even when an objective analysis would show they are not. Status quo bias is one of the most powerful forces in daily decision-making, and one of the least recognized. The decision you think you are not making the choice to stay, to continue, to not change is itself a decision. And like all decisions, it has consequences. The failure to recognize it as an active choice is what allows status quo bias to operate without scrutiny. The third pattern is projection bias, the tendency to project your current emotional state onto your future self when making predictions about future preferences. When you are hungry, you overestimate how much you will want to eat tomorrow. When you are tired, you overestimate how much you will want to rest next week. When you are in conflict with someone, you overestimate how long the feeling of conflict will persist. When you are excited about a possibility, you overestimate how long the excitement will sustain you through the difficulty of pursuing it. The future self is predicted based on the current self state, and since the current state will change, the prediction is systematically wrong in the direction of the current state. Decisions made on the basis of these predictions will be calibrated for a future that does not arrive in the form expected. You have bought things in states of excitement that you did not want in states of calm. You have avoided things in states of anxiety that you would have welcomed in states of confidence. You have made commitments in states of social warmth that your more solitary future self found burdensome. These are not failures of willpower. They are the natural consequences of projection bias operating on decisions about the future. The illusion of rationality is the final piece of this chapter, and it is the most difficult to address precisely because it is an illusion rather than a conscious deception. Most people believe, genuinely, that they can identify when they are making emotionally biased decisions. They believe the feeling of certainty and the feeling of having reasoned something through are reliably different that when they are being emotional. They know it, and when they are being rational, they know that too. This belief is wrong, and it is wrong in a specific way. The mind does not present its processes transparently. It presents its outputs. You receive the conclusion this is a good idea, or this person is untrustworthy, or this risk is manageable without access to the process that produced it. The process may have been emotionally biased, or conformity influenced, or affected by factors that have no logical bearing on the decision. But the output arrives without that history attached. It arrives as a judgment, clean and complete, carrying the same texture whether it was produced by careful reasoning or by a mood. The practice that addresses this is not the impossible task of eliminating emotional influence from decisions. Emotions carry information. They are not noise to be filtered out. The goal is not cold rationality, which is itself a cognitive error, because decisions made without any emotional input tend to be poorly calibrated to what you actually value. The practice is building a minimal verification layer between the initial judgment and the action based on it. A brief internal question: what is my current state? And is it affecting this assessment? Not a demand for certainty about the answer. Just the question, asked consistently, building the habit of checking the state of the instrument before trusting its reading. This habit does not eliminate emotional bias. Nothing eliminates it completely. But it makes the bias visible more often, and visible bias is something you can work with. You can adjust for it, defer the decision to a different state, seek a second opinion, or simply notice that the strong certainty you feel might be partly the product of how you are feeling rather than entirely the product of what you are thinking. There is a practical implication from this chapter that governs several of the later ones. The most consequential decisions in your life, the ones with the largest second-order effects, the ones that shape trajectory over years, should ideally be made in states of relative emotional calm, not necessarily in states of zero emotion, which may not be achievable and may not be desirable, but deliberately not in states of peak emotional activation, whether that activation is enthusiasm, anxiety, grief, or anger. This is not because the feeling is wrong. The feeling may be entirely accurate, but peak activation narrows cognitive scope, amplifies the effect heuristic, and reduces access to the deliberate, second-order thinking that important decisions require. Building time into your decision-making process, not indefinitely, but deliberately, with a specific purpose, is not procrastination. It is the engineering of better conditions for better thinking. The next chapter explains exactly how to use that time. Chapter 3: The Delayed Reaction Principle. Speed is overrated as a cognitive virtue. The culture surrounding decision-making and leadership often presents decisiveness as synonymous with speed. The strong person decides fast. The confident person does not hesitate. The capable person, presented with a situation, produces a response without visible deliberation, because visible deliberation implies uncertainty, and uncertainty implies weakness. This is a useful picture for a narrow range of decisions in a narrow range of contexts. It is actively harmful as a general principle. The decisions that most reliably produce regret are the ones made fastest, under the most emotional pressure in the states of highest activation. The impulsive agreement to something you weren't sure about. The reactive statement made before thinking through how it would land. The immediate response to a perceived slight that escalated what could have been contained. The commitment made in excitement that the calmer future self had to honor or extricate from. Speed in these cases was not a feature. It was the problem. The speed prevented the brief internal processing that would have produced a different, better calibrated output. Delay applied deliberately, as an instrument rather than as hesitation, is something different. It is the deliberate creation of processing time between the situation that calls for a decision and the decision that is produced in response to it. The delayed reaction principle rests on a specific understanding of what happens in the mind during that interval. When you receive a stimulus that calls for a response, a question, an offer, a provocation, a request, a piece of information that implies action, your mind immediately begins generating candidate responses. This happens fast, below the threshold of conscious awareness. By the time you are consciously considering the situation, several candidate responses are already available, already competing for selection. The candidate that wins this internal competition is typically the one with the most emotional salience, the one that is most prominent in memory, most consistent with your current state, most aligned with the automatic pattern that the situation has triggered. This winner is presented to consciousness as the response, clean and complete. The problem is not that this process happens. The problem is when it is the entire process, when the presented candidate is accepted and acted on without the briefest interrogation of whether it is actually the best available response, or whether it is simply the most automatic one. The delay creates the interrogation. Even a brief pause, seconds, sometimes gives the deliberate mind enough time to ask, is this the response I actually want to give? Is there a better one? What does this situation actually require? And is what I was about to say or do the thing that meets that requirement? There is an important distinction between delay as a thinking tool and delay as avoidance. Avoidance is delay without a purpose, the person who defers a difficult conversation indefinitely, who postpones a decision not to think about it more carefully but to not think about it at all, who uses time as an escape rather than as a resource. That person is not practicing the delayed reaction principle. They are practicing something that produces accumulating costs without any of the benefits. The delayed reaction principle is purposive delay. You delay because you have identified a specific need. That time can serve the need to let activation decrease before evaluating an emotional decision. The need to gather a specific piece of information that would change the assessment. The need to observe how a situation evolves before committing to a response. The need to consult a different cognitive state, your less excited self, your less tired self, your morning clarity self rather than your eventing depleted self. Purposive delay knows what it is waiting for. Avoidance just waits. Time is a thinking tool in a specific and underappreciated way. Beyond the immediate effect of reducing activation and giving the deliberate mind more processing space, delay changes what information is available for decision-making. When you encounter a situation and immediately respond, you are working with the information available in that moment, your current state. the immediate framing of the situation as it was presented, the automatic pattern that the situation triggered. This is a narrow information set. When you delay, additional information arrives. The situation may develop in ways that change what response is appropriate. The other person may reveal more of their actual position, removing the need for the response you were preparing. The emotional salience of the initial stimulus may decrease, allowing the features you were underweighting because they were less vivid to become more visible. You may think of something you had not thought of in the first moment. The problem you were about to respond to may solve itself, or change shape significantly, or turn out to require something entirely different from what you initially assessed. There is a related principle that operates over a longer time horizon: the value of observing a situation before acting in it. This principle is most relevant in new environments, a new job, a new social context, a new competitive landscape. The natural pressure in unfamiliar situations is to demonstrate value early, to establish yourself quickly, to produce visible output that signals competence and engagement. The strategic version of entering a new environment runs differently. It begins with observation: what actually happens here, beneath the stated norms and the official structures? Who actually holds influence and through what means? What are the real incentives and constraints, as opposed to the stated ones? What is this environment actually selecting for, and how does what I currently do relate to what it actually rewards? These questions cannot be answered immediately. They require time and attention directed at understanding rather than at production. The person who spends the first month of a new situation observing before acting will, in months 3 and 4, be acting with considerably more accuracy than the person who began producing output in the first week before understanding what kind of output was actually valued. One of the most practically useful applications of the delayed reaction principle concerns responses to things that provoke you. When you receive something provocative, a challenge, a criticism, an unfair characterization, an aggressive communication, the immediate response is rarely the best one. It is typically the most reactive one, the one most directly generated by the provocation, most shaped by the emotional state the provocation has produced, most designed to address the feeling of being provoked rather than the underlying situation. The delayed response, even a delay of minutes, allows for the separation of the feeling of being provoked from the assessment of what the situation actually requires. The feeling may be accurate, the provocation may be genuine, the unfairness may be real, but the response to the situation is a different question from the response to the feeling. What does this situation require? Not what does being provoked make me want to say. The distinction is between being driven by the situation and driving the situation. The reactive response is driven by it. The delayed considered response drives it. And over time, the cumulative effect of consistently responding to situations rather than to feelings about situations constitutes one of the most significant behavioral advantages available. There is a final dimension of the delayed reaction principle that concerns the question of reversibilities. Not all decisions benefit equally from delay. The benefit of delay is proportional to the irreversibility of the decision being made, and inversely proportional to the cost of the delay itself. A highly reversible decision, where the consequences of acting immediately and acting later are symmetric, where you can easily change course if the initial choice turns out to be wrong, does not require extensive delay. The cost of being wrong is low, and the cost of overthinking is real. Delay consumes attention, generates friction, and slows the production of outcomes. A highly irreversible decision, where the consequences of the initial choice are difficult to undo, where time and resources and relationships and reputations have been committed in directions that are expensive to reverse, benefits significantly from delay. The cost of being wrong is high. The cost of taking additional processing time before committing is low relative to that. The strategic mind calibrates the investment in deliberation to the stakes of the decision. Small, reversible decisions decide quickly, move on. Large, irreversible decisions deliberately slow down, resist the pressure for immediate commitment. Use the available time as the tool it is. Most people apply this calibration backwards. They agonize over small decisions, cycling through options that do not significantly differ in their consequences, consuming processing resources on choices where fast and imperfect is better than slow and careful. And they make large, irreversible decisions quickly, under the pressure of the moment, without the deliberate processing that the stakes warranted. Correcting this calibration alone would change the quality of your decision-making substantially. Chapter 4: Decision Fatigue. Your thinking degrades across the day. This is not a metaphor. It is a measurable, documented phenomenon. The quality of decisions made after a sustained period of decision-making is consistently and significantly lower than the quality of decisions made earlier in that period. The capacity for careful analysis decreases. The resistance to impulsive choices decreases. The ability to generate and evaluate alternatives decreases. What remains is a kind of cognitive depletion that the person experiencing it often cannot directly perceive, because the feeling of confidence in one's decisions does not reliably track the actual quality of those decisions. Decision fatigue operates through a specific mechanism. Every decision you make, regardless of how significant it is, regardless of whether it feels demanding or effortless, draws on the same limited cognitive resource. That resource is variously described as executive function, self-regulatory capacity, or deliberate cognitive processing. The labels differ slightly in their technical implications, but the basic finding is consistent: it depletes with use. It is not like attention, which can be replenished by brief rests. It has a daily capacity, and once that capacity is spent, the quality of the thinking it supports decreases until sleep allows restoration. The important implication: the decisions you make after a full day of other decisions are made with a depleted instrument. The instrument does not announce its depletion. You do not feel a clear shift from sharp to dull. The transition is gradual, and the subjective experience of deciding continues much as before. But the quality of the output has changed. Several specific patterns characterize depleted decision-making. The first is a shift toward default options. When cognitive resources are limited, the mind tends toward the status quo, the familiar, the option that requires no departure from existing patterns. This is not irrational. Defaults are often calibrated by previous deliberation and may be genuinely appropriate. But the tendency toward defaults, regardless of whether they are appropriate, removes the evaluation that would distinguish the cases where the default serves from the cases where it does not. The second pattern is impulsive choice. When the capacity for careful analysis is depleted, immediate rewards become more attractive relative to delayed ones. The thing you want right now is harder to defer. the snack you weren't going to eat, the purchase you hadn't planned to make, the agreement you were going to think about more carefully. All of these become harder to resist after a day of extensive decision-making, for reasons that have nothing to do with whether they deserve more or less resistance. The third pattern is decision avoidance. A depleted mind sometimes produces not impulsive choice, but its opposite, paralysis. Deferral, the inability to commit to any option. The analysis required to choose feels inaccessible, so the person defers without deciding, which is itself a decision, with its own set of consequences that are not being evaluated. Decision fatigue compounds with other sources of cognitive load. The quantity of decisions you make is one source of depletion, but the emotional weight of decisions matters, and the novelty of decisions matters, and the stakes of decisions matter, not because high stakes necessarily require more cognitive processing, but because the awareness of high stakes produces a form of background arousal that depletes executive function even when you are not actively deliberating. A person who has spent the morning in a difficult interpersonal situation navigating conflict, managing a sensitive conversation, dealing with an emotionally demanding relationship has depleted decision-making capacity even if they made very few explicit decisions during that time. The cognitive load of the emotional management has drawn on the same resource that explicit decision-making draws on. Similarly, a person navigating a genuinely novel situation, a new environment, an unfamiliar domain, a context where the normal patterns of interpretation don't apply, depletes faster than a person working in a familiar, well-structured environment. Novelty requires active processing. Familiarity allows the automatic system to take over, conserving the deliberate resource for when it is most needed. Understanding decision fatigue changes how you structure your day if you take it seriously. The question it forces is which decisions deserve the cognitive capacity that exists in the morning, and which decisions can be deferred to later, made by default, are predicted in advance through the design of systems. This is not a trivial reorganization of scheduling. It reflects a genuine resource allocation logic. The most consequential, most complex, most irreversible decisions should be made when the instrument for making them is sharpest. The least consequential, most routine, most easily reversible decisions should be automated as much as possible, predicted through habits and defaults so that they do not consume the limited resource that the important decisions need. The person who makes important decisions late in a depleted day, after burning through cognitive capacity on less important ones, is systematically misallocating a limited resource. They are spending expensive currency on cheap items and then discovering they have nothing left for the things that actually cost. Minimizing chaos, reducing the volume and unpredictability of decisions that require deliberate processing is a design challenge rather than a discipline challenge. The instinct is to approach decision fatigue as a willpower problem. If I were more disciplined, I would maintain decision quality across the day. If I were more focused, the depletion wouldn't affect me as much. If I tried harder, I could sustain the cognitive clarity that early day decisions reflect. This approach fails because it is working against the mechanism rather than with it. The mechanism depletes regardless of discipline. Discipline can modestly extend the period before significant depletion occurs. It cannot eliminate depletion. What reduces the cost of depletion is reducing the number of decisions that require deliberate processing through design. through automation, through the construction of defaults and systems that handle routine choices without calling on the deliberate resource. What does minimizing decision load look like in concrete terms? It looks like decisions that were previously made daily being made once and implemented consistently. What you eat in the mornings, not decided each morning from scratch but established as a default that runs without deliberation. What your first 2 hours look like, not composed each day in response to whatever presents itself but structured in advance so that the deliberate resource is not consumed before it reaches what it was most needed for. It looks like identifying the decisions in your daily life that are consuming processing capacity disproportionate to their importance, and finding ways to systematize them to convert them from deliberate choices that require evaluation each time into automatic patterns that run without that overhead. It looks like recognizing the categories of decision that tend to occur when you are most depleted and either moving them to earlier in the day, deferring them to a restored state, or establishing clear decision rules that remove the need for fresh deliberation at the point of decision. There is a social dimension to decision fatigue that deserves specific mention. Depleted states affect not just the quality of your thinking but the quality of your social judgment. The person making decisions in a depleted state is more likely to default to agreeing rather than evaluating, more likely to avoid the friction of a clear refusal, more likely to say yes to things they would have questioned in a clearer state. People who benefit from extracting agreements or commitments from others often consciously or not time their requests for moments of likely depletion. Late in a long meeting, at the end of a demanding day, after a period of many prior decisions, the person being asked is not deliberately compromised, but they are more susceptible in that state to the social pressure toward agreement, less capable of the careful evaluation that a clear no requires. Awareness of this pattern allows for a simple but effective protection when you recognize that you are in a depleted state and someone is asking for a commitment. Defer, not indefinitely, but explicitly, to a time when you can evaluate the request from a condition of restored capacity. The commitment made in exhaustion and then regretted is one of the most common and most preventable consequences of decision fatigue. The system that prevents it is simply the awareness that your state matters for the quality of your decisions combined with the discipline to protect important decisions from depleted states by building time into when they are made. Chapter 5: Designing Your Default. Most of your behavior is default behavior, not chosen in the moment, not the product of deliberation, executed automatically in response to cues in the environment and the internal states those cues produce, according to patterns established by repetition over months and years. Habits, routines, automated sequences, the vast infrastructure of behavior that runs below the threshold of conscious choice and accounts for the majority of what you do each day. This is not a problem, it is an efficiency. If every action required deliberate initiation, ordinary functioning would be impossible. The automaticity of habitual behavior frees cognitive resources for the situations that genuinely require active processing. Without defaults, the cognitive load of daily life would be crushing. The problem is not having defaults. The problem is having defaults that were not designed. The defaults most people operate under were not selected through a deliberate process of identifying what patterns would best serve their goals, values, and long-term interests. They were established by repetition, by doing something enough times that it became automatic. And the things that got repeated were not necessarily the things that were best. They were the things that were easiest, most immediately rewarding, most responsive to the environment as it happened to be structured around the person at the time. Your defaults are the product of your history. They reflect the environment you grew up in, the habits of the people who influenced you, the patterns of behavior that were rewarded by the systems around you. Some of those defaults are excellent. Some of them were producing outcomes you would not choose if you were designing your patterns from scratch. The question this chapter addresses is, how do you move from defaults that were installed by circumstance to defaults that were chosen by design? The principle of minimum resistance is the foundation. Human behavior tends toward the path of least resistance, not as a moral failure, as a structural fact about how behavioral systems operate. Given two available options, the one that requires less friction, less initiation energy, less departure from existing patterns, will be chosen more often. This is as true for people with high levels of self-discipline as it is for those without. The difference is often not in willpower at the point of decision, but in the architecture of the environment that shapes what the path of least resistance actually leads to. The person who keeps nutritious food prominently accessible and less nutritious food either absent or inconvenient has changed the path of least resistance for food choices. The behavior that results is not the product of more willpower in the moment. It is the product of having previously made a single design decision that changed the default behavior for all subsequent moments. This principle extends far beyond food. It applies to every domain where habitual behavior matters, which is every domain. Designing your defaults involves three distinct phases. The first is audit. Before you can redesign your defaults, you need to see them clearly. Most of your defaults are invisible to you because they are automatic. They run without requiring your attention, which means they also run without receiving it. Bringing deliberate attention to what your actual behavioral patterns are, not what you believe they are or would like them to be, but what you actually do consistently across different conditions, is the necessary first step. This audit is most accurate when it is specific. Not "I tend to work hard," but "what is the first thing I do when I sit down to work? What happens to my attention after 40 minutes? What do I do when I encounter resistance in a task? What is my pattern of behavior in the first 30 minutes after waking? In the last hour before sleep? In the period after a difficult conversation?" These specifics reveal the actual pattern, and the actual pattern is the starting point for design. The second phase is selection. Given the patterns you have identified, which ones serve your goals and which do not? This is not always obvious, because defaults that feel comfortable or productive in the moment may not be serving the longer arc, and defaults that feel uncomfortable or inconvenient may be producing outcomes that are worth the discomfort. The second-order thinking from the earlier chapter is necessary here. The default that feels fine today may be compounding into something significant over years. The default that requires effort today may be building something whose value only becomes visible over time. Selection also requires honesty about what you actually want, which is distinct from what you believe you should want, or what you present as your goals in social contexts, or what you aspire to in your most optimistic self-conception. Real default design must be calibrated to actual values rather than performed ones. Designing defaults for the person you present yourself as, rather than the person you actually are, produces defaults that feel foreign and that will not persist through the friction of implementation. The third phase is architecture. Given the patterns you have selected to change, how do you actually change them? The naive approach is Dacian by Dacian willpower at each moment where the undesired default would execute. Choose differently. This works in the short term and fails in the medium term with significant reliability, because it places the full burden of behavior change at the moment of choice, which is precisely the moment when you are least strategically rescued. Because the cue for the default behavior is present, the existing pattern has momentum, and the deliberate override must be supplied fresh each time. The architectural approach changes the environment that produces the default rather than the default itself. It asks what are the conditions under which this default executes, what cues trigger it, what frictions prevent the alternative, and then it modifies those conditions. If the default is to check your phone first thing in the morning, the architectural intervention is not to decide each morning not to check it. It is to remove the phone from the bedroom, or charge it across the room, or establish a visible physical replacement habit, something you do automatically upon waking that occupies the time and attention before the phone checking cue can activate. There is a specific concept that makes default design more precise: the concept of implementation intentions. An implementation intention is a specific, concrete plan that links a situation to a response. Not "I will exercise more," but "when I have finished my morning coffee, I will put on my exercise clothes and leave the apartment before I open my computer." The specificity is the mechanism. By specifying the exact cue when this happens and the exact response "I will do this," the plan becomes more likely to execute automatically when the relevant situation occurs. The decision has been made in advance and encoded as a conditional effects. Then Y, when X occurs, Y executes without requiring fresh deliberation. This is the principle of pre-commitment applied to behavioral design, making the decision once, in a clear state, in a way that reduces the deliberative load at the moment of execution. You are not relying on morning you to decide to exercise. You are relying on morning you to execute a plan that previous you made clearly and concretely. There is a common error in default design that deserves attention. The error is attempting to redesign too many defaults simultaneously. The motivation to change is often highest at the beginning of the redesign process, when the gap between current patterns and desired patterns feels clear and the commitment to closing it feels strong. This motivation produces ambitious plans restructuring mornings, evenings, social patterns, work habits, physical routines, and dietary defaults all at once. The execution fails not because the goals were wrong, but because the cognitive and behavioral resources required to implement multiple simultaneous changes exceed what is available. Each new behavior requires initiation energy and conscious oversight while it is being established. Multiple simultaneous new behaviors compete for that limited resource, and most of them lose. The effective approach sequences rather than stacks. One new default is introduced and practiced until it runs automatically enough to require minimal conscious oversight. Then the next is introduced, building on the foundation of what is already established rather than competing with it. The time frame for this is longer than most people want it to be. A new behavioral pattern typically requires weeks of consistent execution before it begins to run, with anything approaching automaticity, and the specific time frame varies substantially depending on the complexity of the behavior, the frequency of execution, and the degree of friction involved in the early stages. Impatience with this timeline is one of the most common sources of default redesign failure. The person who expects the new pattern to feel natural after 2 weeks and finds it still effortful at 3 weeks concludes that the approach is not working when what is actually happening is normal. The pattern is being established. It takes time. The establishment process is not linear. Understanding this in advance as a fact about how behavioral change works rather than as something that applies to other people but should not apply to you is part of the strategic posture that this chapter builds toward. The outcome of deliberate default design, achieved incrementally and maintained consistently, is a significant one. Your default behavior becomes an expression of your values rather than a product of your history. The automatic patterns running your daily life are the ones you selected for the quality of their consequences, not the ones that accumulated through the path of least resistance in environments you did not design. The infrastructure of your daily existence is built to produce the outcomes you actually want, not perfectly. Not always, but directionally and consistently. That shift from defaults installed by circumstance to defaults chosen by design is perhaps the most concrete expression of strategic thinking applied to daily life. You are no longer primarily reacting to your environment. You have designed your environment to do a significant amount of the work. Chapter 6: Living Intentionally. There is a difference between doing strategic things and living strategically. Doing strategic things means applying deliberate thinking to specific decisions when the stakes seem high enough to warrant it. Planning a major career move carefully. Thinking through a significant financial decision before committing. Preparing for an important conversation in advance. These are valuable practices, but they are episodic. They are applied to the exceptional moments and leave the ordinary ones to run on whatever defaults happen to be installed. And as the earlier chapters have established, the ordinary moments are the ones that compound into trajectory. Living strategically is different in kind. It means that the strategic orientation, the habit of second-order thinking, the awareness of emotional state as a factor in decisions, the design of defaults has become the background mode of operation rather than a technique deployed for special occasions. A strategy is not something you do. It is how you are. This is not a destination reached once and maintained effortlessly. It is an ongoing practice, requiring maintenance and calibration. But the quality of the practice changes over time. What began as deliberate and effortful becomes increasingly automatic, not because the thinking is less rigorous, but because the habits of strategic attention have been practiced enough that they run at lower cost. The architecture of the day is where intentional living is most concretely expressed. Consider what the structure of a day actually determines. It determines what has access to your attention and when. It determines which cognitive states you are in when particular kinds of work or decisions arrive. It determines how much friction surrounds the activities you want to do more of, and how much friction surrounds the ones you want to do less of. It determines the quality of your recovery, whether sleep is protected, whether periods of genuine disengagement or built-in are crowded out by the relentless continuation of stimulation. Most people's days are not designed, they are negotiated. In real time, among competing pressures, the demands of others, the pull of available stimulation, the momentum of existing habits, and the reactive responses to whatever happens to arrive first. The day emerges from this negotiation without having been planned, and its shape reflects the aggregate result of those competing pressures rather than any overriding intention. The deliberately designed day is different not in its rigidity. Rigidity produces brittleness, not strategic living, but in its priorities. It has established in advance which things matter enough to be protected from the competition of other demands. And the protection is structural, not volitional. The important things are scheduled, positioned, and given environmental support rather than simply intended and then left to compete without advantage. Strategic architecture of the day operates at several levels simultaneously. The first level is temporal. When do your most cognitively demanding activities occur? Relative to your peak cognitive state, most people have a period of the day when their thinking is clearest, their focus most available, their deliberate processing most efficient. This period is finite. It diminishes as the day progresses and decision fatigue accumulates. The strategic question is whether the activities requiring your best thinking are positioned in this period, or whether they are crowded out by lower priority activities that arrive first and consume what was most valuable. The second level is attentional. What does your environment make it easy to attend to? And what does it make difficult? The phone that is always present and always interruptible is a structural bias toward reactive attention, toward receiving and responding to whatever arrives rather than attending to whatever matters. The workspace organized around the current project rather than around convenient distraction is a structural bias toward focused production. These structures are not destiny, but they shape probability in ways that accumulate over thousands of working hours. The third level concerns transitions. Most people pay considerable attention to the activities of their day and very little attention to the transitions between them, the periods that separate one activity from the next, during which the cognitive and emotional state from the previous activity has not yet been replaced by the orientation appropriate to the next one. These transitions matter more than they appear to. A person who moves from a charged emotional interaction directly into work requiring focused analysis will not immediately produce focused analysis. They will produce focused analysis colored by the residue of the prior interaction, attention slightly narrowed by the arousal that hasn't yet settled, judgment slightly tilted by the perspective most recently activated. The quality of the subsequent work suffers in ways that are real but difficult to attribute clearly to the transition. Deliberately designed transitions, brief, specific, consistent practices that reset the cognitive and emotional state between activities, or a relatively small investment that produces a meaningful improvement in the quality of attention available for what follows. They do not need to be long. A few minutes of deliberate disengagement, of orienting to the next activity's requirements rather than the previous one's residue, changes the starting condition for the next period of work in ways that matter. When does strategy become a way of life rather than a technique? The shift happens gradually and then more visibly. It happens through the accumulation of enough practice with the habits described throughout this audiobook that those habits begin to run without deliberate initiation when the second-order question is asked before you consciously decide to ask it. When the awareness of your emotional state as a factor in a decision is present without effort. when the structural assessment of a new situation happens before the reactive response. The shift is marked by a change in relationship to difficulty. The person for whom strategy is a way of life does not experience the challenges of daily decision-making primarily as burdens. They experience them as the normal texture of a life being lived deliberately, as the expected content of days that are producing something rather than merely passing. This is not because the challenges are smaller. It is because the orientation to the challenges has changed. There is a specific quality of intentional living that needs to be named, because it is frequently mistaken for something it is not. Intentional living is not the project of optimizing yourself. It is not the pursuit of the most efficient version of your days, the maximum extraction of productivity from your waking hours, the relentless improvement of metrics you have identified as indicators of a life well lived. Optimization of that kind is its own form of reactivity, reactive to the cultural narrative that a valuable life is a maximally efficient one. That time not devoted to measurable output is wasted, that the quality of a day is determined by its produce rather than by who you are within it. Intentional living, as this audiobook has been describing it, is quieter and more fundamental than optimization. It is the alignment of your actual behavior with your actual values, not your stated values. Not your aspired values, but the values that reveal themselves in what you actually attend to, what you actually protect, and what you actually give your most limited resources to. Most people's lives, examined closely, show a significant gap between stated values and behavioral patterns. They say they value depth in relationships and spend their time at the surface of many. They say they value creative work and give their best hours to reactive email. They say they value health and treat it as the first thing to be sacrificed when other pressures arrive. They say they value learning and consume entertainment. This gap is not primarily a failure of discipline. It is a failure of design. The stated value has not been translated into structural support, into the defaults, the environmental architecture, the time allocation that would make it the path of least resistance rather than the path of greatest friction. Closing this gap is the practical project of intentional living. It is specific, concrete, and ongoing. It requires revisiting the alignment regularly, not because the values change often, but because the pressures that erode the alignment are constant, and the drift from intentional to reactive can happen gradually without a consistent mechanism for noticing and correcting it. The daily review, brief, specific, honest, is that mechanism. Not a journal in the comprehensive sense, not a productivity ritual, but a 5-minute habit of honest accounting. What did today's behavior reflect about what I actually value? Where did I act from design and where from default? Where did the day go in directions I intended? And where did it go in directions that were offered to me rather than chosen? This accounting is not self-criticism. It is calibration. It is the mechanism by which the gap between stated values and behavioral reality becomes visible, and therefore something that can be addressed incrementally through the redesign of the defaults and architectures that shape what tomorrow will look like. Strategy applied to the everyday produces a specific kind of person. Not a more impressive seeming person, not a person with a more elaborate routine or more articulated framework. A person who is, in a quiet and structural way, more aligned, whose behavior reflects their values with more consistency, whose decisions reflect their long-term interests with more accuracy, whose use of time and attention reflects what they have actually decided to build rather than what the environment has decided to offer. That alignment is not permanent. It requires maintenance, but it is cumulative in its effects, compounding over months and years into a life whose shape is recognizably the product of what was intended, not in every detail, not without the inevitable influence of things outside your control, but directionally, substantially in the ways that matter. That is what strategic thinking, applied to everyday decisions, actually produces. Not a dramatically different person, a more deliberately constructed one. Closing strategic thinking is quiet, but it changes everything. At the beginning of this audiobook, a claim was made that your life is shaped not by its big decisions but by its unnoticed small ones. That claim is now, if this audiobook has done its work, not abstract, it is specific. You have a clearer picture of the mechanisms through which small decisions accumulate into trajectories, through the compounding of micro-choices into habits, through the quiet operation of defaults that were never examined, through the difference between responding to what the day brings and designing what the day contains. What changes when you see this clearly? Not the immediate texture of your day. The conversations still happen. The decisions still present themselves. The pressures still arrive. The emotional states that color your assessment of options still arise without invitation. The complexity of daily life does not simplify. What changes is the relationship between you and that texture. You are no longer simply inside it, being shaped by it, moving through it on the momentum of patterns you did not deliberately choose. You have a perspective on it, a degree of structural distance that allows the mechanisms to be seen even while you are inside them. And that perspective is itself a form of power, not a dramatic one. Not one that announces itself or that others will necessarily notice immediately, but a quiet, structural power, the power of someone who understands the game being played and is playing it deliberately rather than creatively. Consider what first-order versus second-order thinking has given you. Not the habit of excessive deliberation, of cycling through every possible consequence before allowing yourself to move, but the discipline of extending the question one step further than the obvious first answer. The consistent practice of "and then what?" applied before commitment rather than after. This single extension, practiced until it becomes automatic, changes the quality of decisions across every domain where decisions shape outcomes. Consider what understanding emotional bias has given you. Not the pretense of emotionless rationality, not the old ovulation persona that has mistaken the absence of feeling for the presence of good thinking, but the honest awareness that your current state affects your current assessment, and the minimal verification habit that asks, before acting on a strong judgment, whether the instrument doing the assessing is in the condition appropriate to what is being assessed. The delayed reaction principle has given you something that most people do not have time as a tool. The recognition that delay is not weakness, that the best response to a situation is rarely the fastest one, that the irreversibility of a decision and the cost of the decision are the two factors that most reliably determine how much processing time is worth investing, and that investing it deliberately, as a structural habit rather than as an occasional accommodation, produces decisions whose quality compounds over years. Understanding decision fatigue has changed how you see the resource you are working with. Your thinking is not constant. It is not equally sharp at all hours, under all loads, across all conditions. It is a variable quality instrument that depletes in predictable ways and restores through predictable means. Treating it as a constant, spending it equally across everything the day presents, without regard for what its current quality actually supports, produces systematically worse outcomes than managing it the way any finite, valuable resource should be managed, with attention to how it is allocated. Designing your default has reframed the fundamental question of behavioral change. Not how do I have enough willpower to make different choices in the moment, but how do I change the environment so that the choices I want to make are the ones that require the least effort. Not working against the principle of minimum resistance, but redirecting it. Engineering the path of least resistance to lead where you actually want to go. This is not a minor adjustment in approach. It is a structural reorientation, and its consequences, accumulated over months and years of consistently designed defaults, are visible in the quality and direction of what a life produces. And intentional living, the final chapter's contribution, has pointed toward the integration of all of these practices into something larger than a collection of techniques. A way of being in daily life that is characterized by alignment between values and behavior, between intention and structure, between who you say you are and what you actually do with the finite hours available to you. Not perfect alignment that is not a realistic standard and is not the goal, but consistent, examined, relibratable alignment. The kind that comes from a daily practice of honest accounting rather than from the occasional surge of motivation that produces a new plan and then fades without having changed the underlying architecture. There is a final observation about strategic thinking that is worth making here. It is not visible to most of the people around you. The person who has internalized second-order thinking does not look different in a particular conversation from the person who hasn't. The person who manages their decision-making load carefully does not appear to be doing anything unusual in a given meeting. The person whose day is architecturally designed to support their values does not have a visible marker that distinguishes them from the person whose day runs on unexamined defaults. What is visible is the aggregate, over months. The quality of decisions made by someone practicing consistent second-order thinking diverges from those who don't. Over years, the trajectory of someone whose defaults are designed rather than accidental diverges from those operating on inherited patterns. Over decades, the life built by someone who lives deliberately diverges substantially from the life that accumulated without intention. Strategic thinking is quiet. It does not announce itself. It does not produce visible transformation in a single day or a single week. But it changes everything. Not in the moment, in the compound. Not through a single significant decision, through the accumulated quality of thousands of decisions that were better than they would have been by small but real margins because a trained mind was making them rather than an untrained one. You have more information about your own cognitive architecture than you had before this audiobook began. You have a clearer model of the mechanisms that drive most decision-making, and the specific points at which deliberate practice can intervene in those mechanisms to produce different outcomes. What happens with that information is a decision, and the decision has first-order and second-order consequences, and it will be affected by your emotional state at the moment you make it, and it would benefit from a brief delay before commitment. and it should not compete with too many other decisions made in the same depleted period. And the most reliable way to act on it is to design a default that requires no further decision, just execution. You see the structure now. Most people react daily. You design daily. Strategic thinking is quiet, but it changes everything.